Hey there, this is Kari Hines, your friendly local DAR specialist, and you're listening to The Radar. Welcome or welcome back to our podcast focused on disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. Last January, wildfires spread throughout Southern California, resulting in 30 deaths and the destruction of over 16,000 homes and businesses. It took roughly 31 days until the Palisades fire was completely extinguished. In 2024, Texas experienced its largest wildfire on official record, burning over 1 million acres of land, destroying 127 homes, and resulted in the loss of over 15,000 cattle. Today, we will be honoring the anniversaries of these two catastrophic events by providing information about wildfires. With me today is Kari Hines, who is a program coordinator with the Texas A&M Forest Service. Would you like to go ahead and introduce yourself? Just let everyone know a little bit about you and kind of what you do.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited today. I've spent the last 11 of almost 14 years working for Texas A&M Forest Service, talking to people about wildfire preparedness and the steps they can take, and responding myself to wildfires and being part of that whole process. So it's something I'm super passionate about.
That's awesome. So I'm just going to start with a, maybe a silly question, but one that I think is kind of relevant. What is the most common source of wildfires in Texas?
That's such a great question. We ask this question so often at public outreach events, and almost without a doubt, people will say cigarettes out the window.
Hmm.
9 times out of 10. If I had started collecting quarters at the beginning of my career, when people said cigarettes out a window, I might be able to retire in the next few years. But it is not cigarettes out the window. That's a single point of heat landing at a single place on the side of the road. And cigarettes actually changed many years ago, so they don't burn as long as they used to. Anyway, debris burning. Here in Texas, across the southeastern United States, at large, debris burning is the number one cause of human started fires. A few years ago, we did a data analysis of all the fires that were reported across the state, both from local fire departments and what we respond to. And 50% of all of the fires that were human caused were either debris burning or another category called equipment use. And equipment use is anything that has to do, obviously, with a piece of equipment, anything to do with a car, a UTV, a welder grinder, trailers, right? That's all equipment use. So 50% of all of our fires, equipment use and debris burning.
Yeah, I actually purposely asked that question because I did a little bit of a kind of refresher training on wildfires using the information that you actually presented at your training that I went to. And there are still people who said cigarette butts was the number one cause. So,
Absolutely. And I'll tell you, start collecting quarters now.
mhm,
You can buy something sweet.
yeah. And kind of along the same thread, right? So I think a lot of people kind of have these myths in mind or these facts that might be incorrect. What are some other kind of preconceived notions or misconceptions that you found that people may have when it comes to wildfires?
At the top of my mind is one that you'll hear repeated across the country, and professionals like myself use it all the time as a talking point, is that we can't do anything to protect ourselves from wildfire damages. Um, I think a lot of people, and maybe rightly so, imagine wildfire as this just tsunami like natural event that destroys everything in its path. Oftentimes that's because of the images that we see coming out of media, where it does, when we hear things like wall of fire destroying everything in its path.
Mhm.
And fire does not burn like that. One of the original um, wildfire scientists in the last few decades. His name is Jack Cohen. He's retired now. Has this phrase in one of his videos, and he'll say it again and again. Wildfire burns according to the requirements for combustion. It is not this flood that sweeps across the landscape. We can absolutely do things to influence how our built environment is going to be impacted by wildfire.
Mhm. And kind of going into that wall of fire statement, right? Um, I don't know if people necessarily know the kind of science behind fire in general. So,
hmm
what are some of the factors that are involved when determining things like fire behavior or fire activity?
Yeah, really good question. Turns out firefighters love triangles. So there's lots and lots of triangles out there. So sets of three. So the original fire triangle that you might have learned in science class is the requirements for combustion that we just mentioned. So what do you need to have a fire? You need oxygen, you need a heat source or a spark, and you need something for it to burn. You take away one of those three things, you can't have a fire. In structure firefighting, they'll do things to often decrease the amount of oxygen going to that fire, smothering it, right? We can't do that in wildland fire on large scales. So we try to remove the fuel source. So you still have heat, you still have oxygen because it's in the environment, but it's the fuel side of the triangle that we're trying to influence in wildland fire response. The next triangle that you referenced is our fire environment triangle. You'll also hear it called the fire behavior triangle. And these are the three things, large categories that influence how a fire burns. So you have weather, topography, and fuels. There
Mhm.
again, there it is. It's on both. It's fuels. So weather, how hot is it? How long has it been since it last rained? What's the humidity? How windy is it? Topography, are you on slope? Are you in high elevation? Are you in low elevation? Are you at the bottom of the creek bed? Are you at the top of the mountain? Stuff like that. And then fuels, what is burning? What type of material is it? What sort of condition is it? Where on the landscape is it? Is it right along the ground? Is it higher in the air? Is it the tops of the trees? So all of those things influence how a fire burns.
Mhm. And so just a question in general, because when I was trying to kind of do the refresher training, I don't know if I explained it necessarily very well. Um, there's low relative humidity that kind of is one of the factors that plays into fire weather conditions.
Hmm.
Do you know of any kind of like simplistic definition that people can kind
Oh
of
no.
look at?
Oh,
Um,
put me on the spot.
sorry.
I mean, the most layman terms is how crunchy it is outside,
Okay.
right? Like
That's so much better than mine.
I can give, we can look up fancy definitions.
Mhm.
How much moisture is in the air compared to the ability for the air to hold moisture. I'm saying that poorly. But when we're describing it to the layman's terms, how crunchy is it? Do you go outside and sweat? Or does all that sweat disappear off your skin automatically? And if all that sweat is disappearing and the grass is a little bit crunchy, probably getting a little bit dangerous when it comes to potential wildfire behavior. Here in Texas, in particular, for the lower and eastern 2/3 of the state, low humidity plus windy days
Mhm.
are when we start seeing problematic fire behavior.
Yeah, I think because 'cause I'm not from Texas, I moved here, but I had never heard of a red flag warning before moving here, and so it was very interesting to learn. I mean, I think in my brain I knew, okay, wind is probably bad. It'll kind of push that fire forward much faster, but I never really knew that there was an actual warning that was issued
Yeah, National Weather
specifically.
Service. Yeah, it's a National Weather Service product. It does mainly look at your wind, and this can be an issue in places like the Texas Panhandle where it's windy all of the time.
Mhm.
So if the National Weather Service is issuing alerts so often, because just based off of the wind, that alert can start losing its effect. And that's a whole nother conversation in emergency management is the how are we alerting properly? We're not going to get into that. But in some places like the Panhandle, National Weather Service has worked with local officials to develop an index scale. So you'll have like various levels of intensity of that red flag warning.
Mhm.
Um, to account for the fact that you're always going to have like 15-mile-per-hour winds in Lubbock.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, so kind of on a different thread, right? Because I think a lot of people think wildfires and they think forest fires or they think rangeland. How does the urban environment kind of affect maybe fire behavior or kind of affect like the major impacts of a wildfire?
Such a good question. I mean, you're hinting back at even the change of Smokey Bear's slogan, right? It
Hmm.
went from only you can prevent forest fires to only you can prevent wildfires. One of the reasons being that fires happen in more than just forests, right? So broadening that definition. Um, Foresters, wildland fire managers have, of course, been responding to wildfires in the United States for over 130 years, and there's a big history there. But um, we have categories. that tell us, based off of what sort of natural vegetation is out there, what sort of fire behavior we might be able to detect. Um, the built environment does not have that definition attached to it. When people, who, as we've already said, are the main cause of wildfires, live in direct proximity and are recreating or are working in direct proximity to these ecosystems that historically would have burned on a regular basis. The majority of Texas has ecosystems that would have burned to some low intensity, probably every 1 to 10 years, right? Our
Hmm.
ecosystems are wildfire evolved. And now we have put the number one cause of wildfires in those ecosystems. And we've put a bunch of stuff out there, our cars, our homes, our businesses, our infrastructure, that is susceptible to that fire. So the wildland urban interface, of course, is a unique situation where we're trying to manage wildfire, but in a way that also protects people
Hmm.
and protects our communities.
So I think another thing that people may not necessarily realize or think about is that wildland urban interface, it looks like a whole bunch of different things. It's not necessarily like, oh, my backyard is a forest or I live on a large plot of land. It can look like Central Park in New York City. It can look like, um, Lake Travis is actually a satellite image that I use because
Hmm.
it's like you have those homes that are integrated into
Yeah.
kind of that green space.
Yep.
And then you also have these subdivisions that have a fairly clear delineation between here are all of these, maybe apartment complexes or condos or family homes, schools, and then you have, more of a green space over
Yeah.
there. So, what kind of WUI or wildland urban interface do we have here in Texas?
I mean, you just did such a great job of explaining some of those major differences, right? So there's three major categories of wildland urban interface. What would be called interface or classic. You described it, right? You have that subdivision. It backs up to, maybe what used to be ranch land or maybe agriculture land. You have a little bit more rural area where, lots are 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 acres or more. And and we certainly have a lot of both of those, right? We have a lot of area that is being converted from maybe historically agriculture and it's getting sold out to developers and it's getting apartment complexes, it's getting small lot acreage. Of course, we have just a plethora, probably the majority of the state is in rural wildland urban interface. But the third type that almost no one thinks about, even when you're in this career field, is what's called occluded wooing.
Hmm.
Occluded WUI is when you have natural areas completely surrounded by development. And this is the type of situation where people are usually not even thinking that they could be impacted by wildfire. The rural people, they've probably grown up with it, especially we mentioned Smokehouse earlier. Those ranchers, those generational families have been impacted by multiple fires over their lifetime. That is something that happens up there. Um, some of our more traditional classic WUI areas. I'm thinking Bastrop. I'm thinking Palo Pinto County, some of our places in East Texas. They get fires, and it's a little bit more classic. But occluded WUI, those residents are not thinking about wildfire preparedness. They're not thinking about potentially having to evacuate because of a wildfire. And we certainly have a lot of um, rightly so protected, preserved green spaces inside our communities that are, I mean, just as at risk for wildfire starts than anywhere else.
And I think it's a little difficult to kind of reach those people in those more urban spaces, especially like here in Austin, for instance. You're in a city. You think there's not going to be wildfire in Austin. But the Palmer Lane fire happened over, I think it was in Cedar Park.
It did. Yeah.
But fairly close to Austin, it is more of the urban area. We have green spaces here in the city. I haven't been to Houston yet personally, but I'm sure there's green spaces there too.
They've got some glorious green spaces. What protects our green spaces, and I'm going to say one of the reasons that we don't have fires as often as some other parts of the country, obviously Southern California comes to a lot of people's mind, the Intermountain West, so Nevada, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona. Um, we don't have quite as many fires. We said it earlier. Usually we need both low humidity and very windy days combined with drought stressed vegetation. And especially over the last few years, we haven't had many days where all of those things line up. We certainly have drought stricken vegetation. we'll have really low humidity days, but the winds are less than 10 mile per hour. And then we'll get really high winds, 15, 20, 25 mile per hour, but the humidity is a little bit higher on that day. So we historically, especially the last few decades, when people are, this is a profession that we're working in, and people have been, of course, impacted by fires, but we don't see quite as much because of the overlap of those three items.
And that makes sense.
If that makes sense. I don't
No, it
know if I
does.
did a great job explaining that.
No, that makes perfect sense. So, kind of reaching out to those people who are more in that cityscape. Again, landowners are more likely, I suppose, to kind of be more familiar with wildfires and kind of know about preventative measures. They kind of know what wildfire is going to look like in their area. Um,
Versus
looking,
somebody who lives in an apartment complex, like on
yeah,
the Palmer Lane fire, where
hmm
all of a sudden you have an entire apartment complex and daycares being evacuated during 5 o'clock rush hour.
hmm
Yeah, very, very different situation. Our urban occluded WUI residents, I'll call them since we've defined it, uh, are extremely hard to reach.
hmm
Right? That's I don't think I need to say more than that about it.
hmm Um, So, specifically for kind of getting them a little bit more informed, you think of the more rural areas, you think of how that fire spreads. There's vegetation, the fire is going to be moving through that vegetation, but that's not the only way that fire is going to reach a home. So, what are the ways that homes can be damaged or destroyed by a fire?
Fabulous question. And I was going to earlier when we were talking about WUI, talk about this, and it's because of embers, right? I know
hmm
that's what you're guiding me to. So embers, which are little pieces of burning material, or maybe not so little pieces of burning material that are lofted up from a burning wildfire, especially when we're on really windy days, and they blow ahead of the fire, and they find all these little nooks and crannies, all of these little corners and crevices to gather in, kind of like leaves dropping in the fall. Or maybe if you're someone who's familiar with snow drifts, where snow gathers around the corners of the house. And these embers will cause absolutely damage over time. And in fact, we know that embers are something like 80%, depending on which specific fire you're looking at. But researchers have told us it's like 80 to 85% of all destroyed homes are because of embers. Homes themselves are generally fairly resistant to fires, especially when you're in a managed landscape. Right. So the fire comes out of the quote unquote natural area, unmanaged forest, hayfield, whatever it is. The fire comes out of that. It reaches your landscaped yard, and it usually decreases in intensity, generally speaking. However, embers don't care about your maintained lawn. They hop right over that maintained lawn, and they sit in your firewood pile, or they get in through your attic vents, or they push up against your wooden deck with mulch down in the bottom. And embers do us in more often than not.
hmm And kind of talking about where those embers are landing. Now, I, after your training, realized driving through my neighborhood and also the neighborhood that's across the street from me, people really love their ornamental plants here in Texas.
We love them.
Um, so I kind of wanted to ask, just is there like a little list off the top of your head, about like high risk fuels and why they would be kind of considered high risk?
Yeah, really good question. There are so many different types of possibilities for specific plant lists, right? We have lots and lots of both native and ornamental plants here in Texas, and we get questions a lot. They say, "Give me a list of plants that I can plant that will be safe." And I say, "Well, I, like we could make a plant list, but what you just led me into, which I very much appreciate, is what are the characteristics of those plants? So, not necessarily each and every single good or bad plant, but what are the characteristics? Starting off the list, a plant that is more resilient to fire, less likely to burn, is a well maintained plant,
hmm
right? Something that is getting appropriately watered, following your drought restrictions. Um, Plants that do not have a lot of oils or resins in them. So if you think about a lot of your evergreen shrubs, those are something that are going to have some volatile compounds in them. Here in Central Texas, a little bit further east of where we are, Yopon. Yopon's a native. There's tons of it. Fabulous wildlife habitat and food provider during the winter months for our birds. Um, it does not always readily burn, but when it's dry enough, it will absolutely combust spectacularly. You don't need to get rid of all of it from your lot, but maybe they're right up next to your house. It should not be. So a well-maintained plant, a plant with low volatiles, low oil compounds, something that does not produce just a ridiculous amount of dead material that is going to gather underneath it. And of course, if you do have something like that, you just make sure you're cleaning it out on a regular basis, right?
Mhm.
Something that does not retain a bunch of dead material either. So if you look inside that, the bush, let's, maybe Texas sage, for example, you pull back the outside layers of branches, and on the inside, you have a whole bunch of shaded out dead twigs that are still maintained on the bush. That is a plant that is holding a lot of dead material in it. Again, I'm not saying get rid of all your Texas sage. I have one almost right next to my front door, but I'm maintaining it in a way to decrease its risk. So something that does not come in direct contact with the ground underneath it, right? If you have a plant that naturally has a growing habit that goes all the way from the ground to, 15, 20 feet in the air, that's not something you need to have right up next to the house. But I think these lists can get overwhelming when a lot of people think, well, I can't have any of that around my house. And the good news is, I love that there's good news that research and firsthand accounts from wildland firefighters have shown that the first 0 to 5, and if you want to give it a little bit more, 0 to 30 feet around the base of that house is the most important area to look at for decreasing these risks. So look
Mhm.
at where your mulch is. Look at where your high risk plants are. I said it earlier. I have Texas sage next to my front door. But I'm watering it, I'm pruning it, I keep the dead material out from underneath it, I'm modifying it. If you have the options to take a list to your local native nursery and say, hey, I want a plant that has low volatiles, a low growing habit, something that's going to be drought hardy, something, I got to put my plugs in for native. It'll be something that is less likely to be an issue. National recommendations are that we don't have pretty much any combustibles within the first 5 feet of the house.
Mhm.
If that is not working for you, modify it.
Mhm. And so my next question is kind of how to manage all of those materials if they do have them, because again, we don't have to get rid of everything. You can have your really pretty plants on your property. Just make sure that they're well maintained, as you said. Um, this is maybe like a oddball question, probably like a one in a million thing. But if they look at a list of plants that are highly volatile, and they realize, oh no, I have X amount of acreage, and I am realizing that all of the trees on my property are essentially highly volatile. Um, is there anything different that they can do, or is it just maintaining? Because I think even if they wanted to break it up a little bit, right, and have some paths in there, I would assume that would be a huge undertaking for that landowner. So I don't know if you have any kind of, but I know it's a tough question. I don't
No, it's a
know.
great question. Because I just said it, like decrease the amount of volatile material you have on your property. If you have mostly pines, mostly junipers, mostly eastern red cedars, well, that's all I have. What do you
Hmm.
want me to do? And I should have clarified earlier. I said that the most important area around the house is 0 to 5 feet, 0 to 30 feet, and the house itself.
Hmm.
So the structure that you're protecting and the first 5 feet around it are the most important locations to make progressive changes to decrease risk. And I think that's important. Your question, the what do I do if my entire lot is like this? Well, what's the goal of the work that you're trying to undertake? Is it that your house has a decreased chance of being damaged or destroyed during a wildfire? Well, great news. Structure itself first 5 feet, maybe first 30 feet around it. If you have the capabilities, either financial or physical ability to do more, fabulous. If you're looking at doing something more like a natural resource restoration project, where you're looking at decreasing the amount of vegetation that maybe historically would have been managed by wildfire before we stopped all of them from burning. Doing things like increasing both the vertical and the horizontal distance between your high risk fuel types can can really be a major impact. So we're not saying get rid of all of your juniper, especially if you're in the hill country and that's the majority of what you have and it's why you bought that lot. In the first 30 feet around your house, decrease it. Um, Take off those lowest limbs near the ground. So if a fire is burning in the grass, that it doesn't come in contact with those limbs. Outside of the 30 feet, maybe outside of the 100 feet, it's poking holes in that canopy. That way, if something more high risk, more extreme on one of those very windy, very dry days comes through, if we can increase the distance between those high risk vegetation types, um, we decrease potentially the rate of spread of a future wildfire.
And I didn't ask the question to freak anyone out there. So if you're listening and you realize you have a whole bunch of juniper in your backyard, really the question was just to try and have you feel a little bit more empowered about your decisions, about how you can make your property maybe just a little safer, make you feel better about a potential wildfire in your area.
I've worked with a lot of hill country landowners who get really, really worried if they're even willing to come and hear us talk or to invite me out to their property, which is always an honor. But they're extremely worried that we're going to come out and tell them to cut everything down.
Mhm,
We hear that so often that we don't want to do that work because you're going to tell us to cut everything down. And that is not what this world of wildfire preparedness is. We might encourage you to decrease the density,
mhm.
but there is always an option for decreasing risk somewhere. We can make recommendations fit to all preferences.
And we've already kind of covered it a little bit more with my kind of very specific question. But are there any ways people can be proactive when it comes to preparedness and risk reduction? I guess specifically, what is it? The ignition zone?
The ignition zone concept, the structure itself, and the zone 0 to 5, 5 to 30, 30 to 100 feet.
Mhm.
Yeah,
So we kind of already talked about that a little bit, right? Are there different recommendations you would have for someone for intermediate and then
extended.
advanced? Yeah, the
Yeah,
extended zone as well.
yeah. There's certainly a decreasing level of intensity of recommendations when you get further out from the house. Where in the first 5 feet around the house, the recommendations will be to severely decrease the amount of combustibles, right? And the further you get out from the house, there's going to be less intensity of those recommendations. Um, the ignition zone concept just has so many resources online. I was about to say we could do a multi-day class on that. I have done
Mhm.
multi-day classes on that. That's where we met. Um, but preparedness is more than just the ignition zone. And I know, of course, you've talked previously about like emergency kits and how to receive emergency notifications.
Mhm.
That's also another extremely important part of wildfire. We've talked a bit already about prevention. If you can stop the fire from happening to begin with, then we don't need to worry about if our structure is going to burn down or not because we've learned about how to properly debris burn. I said it earlier, debris burning is our number one cause. I do debris burning on my property. I also do it in a way that when I walk away from it, it's completely out, right? And there are ways to do debris burning poorly and properly, and
Mhm.
we have classes for that. Your equipment use, keeping your equipment in good condition, making sure your tow chains aren't dragging down the road, checking the condition of your tires when you're welding and grinding, making sure maybe you have a spotter nearby, maybe you have a fire extinguisher or a water bucket, right? If we can stop the fire happening to begin with, then that's also part of preparedness. So there's all sorts of different levels there.
Yeah, that's another thing is roadside sparks. So getting your equipment prepared and making sure it's safe to drive on the road before you go out kind of reduces the likelihood that you're going to cause problems
Absolutely.
outside of your immediate
I think
area.
we said it earlier that a lot of people think that cigarettes out the windows
Mhm.
one of the top causes, and I'm pretty sure it's because people see roadside starts,
Yeah.
and it is not. It is more often than not going to be your secure lines or your safety chains dragging on the road, and every single time that metal hits the road, you are having a spark. In fact, I was out in Spicewood fire department teaching a class recently, and they had a segment of chain that they found on the road. They had there was multiple roadside starts within a small vicinity, and they found this just melted down piece of chain that had a lot of damage on it, where you could see it had been rubbing on the road over and over and over again, and it eventually caused some fires, and it actually broke off of whatever it was being dragged. So
Well, at least it's not on that vehicle
it's
anymore.
not on that vehicle anymore.
Hopefully that reduced risk for that specific vehicle, or they're still dragging something. Who knows? Um, but yeah, so I think doing that preventive maintenance. Also, back to the debris burning. I feel like the advice I'll give is treat it like a pot on your stove. You're not gonna leave that pot on your stove unattended. You're gonna want to keep eyes on it. You're gonna want to make sure that, hey, if your pot boils over, move it off of the stove or
Have a
have
way
a
to
plan.
address that.
Mhm,
Yeah, we always recommend having what's called a feed pile. So you're not going to burn your entire pile at once, because that's potentially going to be very large, um, cause more issues for everything around it. But also, if you do need to leave partway through, you can just stop feeding your fire. So you
mhm,
start with something smaller and you just move material into it as you go. And if you need to stop, you can.
mhm,
It also usually ends up being a more successful burn rate. You'll get more of your debris burned completely, because instead of this very, very hot, intense pile that like flames up really quickly and then kind of lowers in intensity, you can keep that intense heat right there in the core. And my father-in-law was out on my property, and years and years and years ago. And he goes, "What are you doing burning like that?" I'm like, "Just you wait." And by the end, there was not a single stick left in my pile. There were no stumps, there were no sticks. Everything burned completely through. I'm like, see, see,
mhm,
see, this is good.
mhm. Now, going back to kind of the property itself, um, I feel like the advice that you give is applicable to multiple types of properties, right? Whether someone has a ranch versus maybe they live in a mobile home versus they live in kind of the cookie cutter suburban home, right?
Yeah.
Are there any differences at all how you would kind of advise someone to maybe prepare their home or their version of their property,
Yeah.
comparatively speaking to other types of properties?
Very good question. I think we were talking about misconceptions. Another large misconception is that if you don't live in these like $1 million mansions, you can't do anything either, right? That,
Hmm.
maybe you have a wooden siding, maybe you have a vinyl sided building, maybe it's elevated, and that means I can't do anything either. And great news, you still can. However, instead of maybe just the 0 to 5 or 0 to 30 foot zone, you need to keep what could be a high intensity fire a little bit further away from your structure, because it's that vinyl, that wood isn't as resistant to combustion as, say, a brick or a masonry or a fiber cement board. I have seen fires, I've been on fires where RVs survived without any intervention from firefighters, because it was far enough away from the other things that were burning that it never met the need for combustion. So you can absolutely do that. It might just need to be a little bit more of a bubble around your structure. Same thing if you live on the top of a hill. Fire moves faster uphill. You're going to need more distance, more separation from those potentially extreme flames, if you're at the top of a hill. If you live on a fairly large property, with more than just a very short driveway attached to it, you need to think about whether or not first responders can even get to your structure to defend it to begin with.
Hmm.
If a fire truck cannot drive down your driveway safely, more often than not, they will not, because it is not safe for them. And that's not just for wildfire. It's if you have a kitchen fire, do
Hmm.
you want a big red shiny fire engine being able to get to your house? I do.
Hmm.
Let's make sure the trees are both up enough and back enough from your driveway, that you don't have an entrance gate that isn't wide enough for our emergency responders to gain access to your property.
Hmm. And I guess for anyone out there looking for resources, I know you said there's a wealth of resources out there and you've done multi-day courses, but just to get them started, right? Are there any major resources that are free, preferably, for Texans that they can kind of take a look at for wildfire preparedness?
Sure. I'm gonna say our own website first.
Hmm.
So if you go to Texas A&M Forest Service, there's options for residents and then learning about wildfire. Lots of information there. A lot of the information we as professionals take and then make consumable for the public comes from the National Fire Protection Association, who manage the Firewise USA program. So you can go to firewise.org. There's a search bar on that website that's you can just type in wildfire and it'll give you everything on there. If you're somebody who's more interested in the construction science side of things and a lot of the research that actually if you want to see the proof in the pudding, we'll call it,
Hmm.
you can go to the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, IBHS. You just type that into your search engine, IBHS and wildfire, and you will get just more resources than you could care to ever read about not only the research they do, but also the case studies that have come out post wildfire disasters on what are we seeing actually happened. Um, Fire Adapted Communities is another great program.
Hmm.
Fireadaptedcommunities.org. I think it's just, yeah, fireadapted.org, I think. That's another really great one too.
Yeah, I know I'm a little bit of a nerd, so I personally looked at fire adapted communities, and I also went back to the Palmer Lane fire, that
Yes.
case study that you shared,
Yeah.
because I was like really interested in kind of exactly what led to it, what the actions were taken, all of that. And I personally found it interesting. I know that I do emergency management for a living, but I feel like there's someone out there who's also just as nerdy, who's just very interested.
Well, and wants to see locally appropriate, right? There's only so many websites that we can look at that have like the Rocky Mountains plastered all over them
Hmm.
or Southern California plastered all over it and like make it feel appropriate to me.
Hmm.
And that's one of the reasons we created the Palmer Lane fire story map to begin with is this is something that happened in Texas that's appropriate for our citizens and the public that I'm here to help. So
Hmm. And for anyone who's actually interested, even if you just want to take a look, it is very readable, at least in my opinion.
thank you.
So don't be too concerned that you're going to take a look at it and not necessarily understand the data or the message that is kind of coming across.
That was the goal, was
Hmm.
it? For it to be
Absolutely. Yeah.
consumable.
And then, kind of on the flip side, so after a wildfire takes place, is there kind of a location that people can go to look at recovery resources, whether or not that's either grants or funding or just information in general of, hey, this happened to me. What do I do now?
That's a that one's harder,
I know.
unfortunately. Um, Within Texas A&M Forest Service, we do have some one pagers,
Hmm.
specifically about like, can this tree be saved type information. There's graphics that show like, if it's this type of tree or if this much of the canopy is burned, like maybe leave it or maybe take it. We have done post fire recovery workshops before. Um, Bastrop County had them for years after the Bastrop County complex and the Hidden Pines fires. Um, Northwest Texas had some after there was a couple summers ago. There was a whole bunch of fires that impacted a lot of property up there. So we'll do workshops. Nationally, there's some better resources on recovery. Unfortunately, that one it is also extremely case dependent, which I hate
Hmm.
saying. I can't believe I haven't said it depends yet. That's I think I'm famous for saying that. But it is so very case dependent on what is applicable and what certain cities or counties have access to.
Yeah, and I think that's completely fair because I know that even for me, like if I'm working at a DRC, a disaster recovery center, and I'm kind of at a table handing out resources to people, we kind of do more of the ag properties, right? We're like, here is information for landowners. And then if it's general residents, we usually direct them over to, at least here in Travis County, usually HHS or someone else who's kind of just across the room from us. So I think saying that it depends, it really truly does because it's dependent on the property, it's dependent on the county, dependent on the location.
It's a frustrating answer, but
It is, yeah,
it's unfortunately it's an answer.
yeah. But I do recommend that if there is a major disaster and they have set up some sort of resource area, that people go there,
Yep.
and that way, your county or your city or your jurisdiction should have the appropriate resources to kind of help you out.
Yeah. I think ending with this fire adapted communities concept. I know we mentioned the website a second ago. It really is not up to any one individual as to whether it's a make it or break it situation, right? There is a role for everyone to play, whether you're an individual resident, whether you're a first responder or an emergency response, whether you're in public health, whether you're in codes and ordinances, whether, right, there's all of these different roles to play. And this is one part of it when it comes to, I think, we've mostly spoken about individual resident perspective, and this is not it. There's even more. We can go out and learn.
So I just want to say thank you for making the drive out here. For anyone, because we don't have this on video, Kari is the first person who's actually driven to my office for one of the podcast episodes. So I really appreciate you taking the time to come out to Austin. For all of our listeners out there, thank you for tuning in. As a reminder, we will be uploading 2 new episodes each month, so feel free to subscribe to our podcast so you can stay up to date as new episodes are released. And with that, we will see you all in the next episode. Bye!